This year, Russia attempted to do something that no country had ever done before, to temporarily disconnect itself from the internet. And it did. It was part of a test by the Kremlin to build a sovereign internet with greater oversight over the country's digital infrastructure and data. But national efforts to tighten control over the web are not unique to Russia. Cyber sovereignty, a concept championed by China, is becoming increasingly popular across the globe. Beijing has overseen a massive digitization of all aspects of social and economic life in recent decades. But this has come with intense government scrutiny over all things internet. A great firewall stops citizens from freely accessing the World Wide Web. Digital communication is routinely monitored, and critical information infrastructure operators are required to store most data in the country. This is because, in Beijing's view, governments, not companies or NGOs, should ultimately oversee the digital space, and national authorities should retain full control over content and data flows within their borders. Proponents say this is key to enhancing cybersecurity, blocking foreign influence on critical infrastructure, and fighting misinformation. Yet, critics see cyber sovereignty as a threat to internet freedom and a tool used by authoritarian governments to cover for censorship, surveillance, collecting sensitive data, and cracking down on free speech. Still, even democratic nations are now starting to talk about cyber sovereignty, as concerns grow over the outsized influence big tech firms have on the digital ecosystem. The European Union, for example, has started promoting digital sovereignty as a way for citizens, businesses, and states to take back control of their data and protect their privacy. Over the past year alone, authorities in at least 48 countries pursued new rules for tech companies on content, data, and competition, according to Freedom House. With the internet fast becoming a key ideological battleground between China and the West, there have been growing calls from academics and digital rights activists for democratic states to develop a common approach technology, one rooted in the respect for human rights and supported by a shared model of governance. We are at a crossroads. Will cyber sovereignty become the new model, or will different systems emerge? And what does all of this mean for internet freedom, and for us, the people?
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this panel. I would like to welcome all of our guests, thank them for being here today, and let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, let's start with a very obvious question. How do we define cyber sovereignty? And is that definition apt for today, considering all the new technologies that are coming forth, such as 5G, soon 6G, quantum computing, and VR, AR technologies? And this question is open to everybody, and we can start with that.
So hi, Wafa, and thank you so much for that opening question. I can start us off on the conversation. Such a pleasure to be here and to have this really important conversation today. I think it's important to note that we use the term cyber sovereignty almost synonymously with a few other terms that are out there, like internet sovereignty and digital sovereignty. And I think for the most part, we've been associating cyber sovereignty with the idea of government control over information technologies. But I think we'll get into this a little bit later, that it's really not just about government control over internet technology. We also are grappling with the idea of information control more broadly, and who has the right to information, who has the right to control how information is shared. But the cyber sovereignty term has, to my mind, been very much associated with some of Beijing's activities and its own borders to control information flows, to use technological capabilities to surveil and often repress their own population. But of course, this is not just a quote unquote China problem. Many countries are pursuing similar efforts in their effort to control information flows domestically and also externally facing.
Thank you so much, Alina. And well, I guess I'll thank you. That set us up really, really nicely here. Professor Lon, I would like to turn to you if possible. What do you think are, Alina already mentioned some of the different concerns related to information control when it comes to cyber sovereignty, and how there are different types of understandings of what that means when it comes to allowing and facilitating the flow of data and information. What do you think are some of the common concerns that unite all nation states, essentially all around the world, that they'll eventually face when dealing with digital governance, no matter what?
Well, I think that I think some my colleagues here are trying to dramatize the differences among different countries in terms of the way they govern the digital space. I think that the realities are much more complicated and probably less than dramatic as one would portrayed here. I think that all the countries, all the government, wanted to use the technology to generate benefits for the general public, and also to minimize the cost and the risks, that may be generated from, the use of the technology. And I think that for people who are, making accusations of China's control and surveillance or whatever, they should come to China and experience themselves. And then I think they will know how do you control the 1.4 billion people, how do you control their use of the technology. And certainly, I think every government have their own concerns about the security of the country, about the safety of the data, and about the privacy of the individuals. So I think that they have different ways to govern the use of the technology. And I think the differences are probably much more in the context, in the culture, in the tradition, and in terms of the risks that they perceive. So I think that dramatizing the differences, trying to show, to polarize the so-called China model and other model, I think that's actually, it's only going to hurt the welfare and the use of the technology, and makes it difficult for us to find a common path in protecting the personal privacies, and also to be able to find a better way to link with one another. Now, I think that's probably not the best way.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to push a little bit, actually, because I really appreciate the nuance that you add to this conversation so far. But what do you think are some of the concerns that all governments really have to face together? And then what are some of the divergences according to your perspective?
Well, I think that, of course, every government have concerns about the potential risks to digital space. For example, the information security issue. For example, the individuals' privacy, how to protect individuals' privacy, and those are common concerns for every government. And also the reliability of the technology and the system. So that's all the common concerns.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you. And so, Javi, I'm going to turn to you, because so far we have been discussing nation states, governments, more of the state side of control and definition of cyber sovereignty. I want to actually turn to the users. Where do they fit into all of this? Where are they in the picture?
Well, thanks, Wafa. I think that the user falls in the losing side of this discussion, I would say. Most of the examples that we have seen around the world of the usage of these concepts, such as sovereignty, safety, the public good, and so on, have so far been used to abuse the power of state. As you know, in Access Now, we run a 24/7 digital security helpline where we offer digital security advice to journalists, activists around the world. And in most cases, the violators of these rights to privacy, rights to free expression, rights to freedom of association, and so on, have been states, right? And these concepts have been used and are being used as a way of violating the rights. So I would say that I would agree with Professor Lan in the sense that we don't need to dramatize some of these situations. Sometimes it's easy to fall into the demonizing certain concepts or ideas or countries. I think that is true. But at the same time, I would say that even though diversity in political and practical views is good, relativity or relativization of concepts such as human rights and their exercise is bad. And we have seen this happening in places like Hong Kong, for example, right? Where the civic space is shrinking thanks to new legislation that aims at controlling and offering safety and security, but it ends up being used to silence activists and journalists, right? So that's a key example, I would say. And just to finalize, I would just like to pinpoint one thing that was said, which is the concern about how to control the internet and what people is doing. I think that's key to understand, right? If the ideal of the state is to exert control, then you have a certain model of sovereignty and of exercise of power in mind. If the aim of the state is to safeguard rights, then the model is different. So I would say that this is sovereignty is a practical concept that we need to see in the light of human rights.
I'm really glad that you brought up rights, Javi, because that's actually what comes to mind. Even just the fact that there's a debate, a lexicon debate around the notion of sovereignty. If you look at where else sovereignty is used, it's often for movements led by people, whether it's indigenous data sovereignty or really or other movements where people are trying to ensure that the power, the wealth, the commodification of data and its transformation stays within communities and from the people from whom they're often extracted. So I think the fact that you have these terms kind of rising that's really where I think the greatest polarity is between the people who believe in an inherent human rights frame and are fighting for those rights, and then the notion that the state takes all.
Absolutely. And this nuance is actually something I would love to turn to Alina to kind of help us understand more. You mentioned, Bob, that the polarity is not really around two different countries. It's more about how they interact with user data and human rights. Alina, could you walk us through this nuance of, it's not really bipolar, is it? It's not two corners, two polar controls of the internet. Could you walk us through that a little bit? And then to further add another layer to that, how do current transatlantic divides between, for instance, the EU and North America and the United States further complicate this, according to you?
Well, thanks so much, Wafa, for that question. I think Bob is, absolutely right on this point that we tend to think, because it's comfortable, in binaries. There's the authoritarians versus the democracies. There's the vision of digital surveillance or digital authoritarianism versus capitalist surveillance, right? Surveillance capitalism, as some have called it. But I think in reality, if we look at the globe and the world, we actually see that the world doesn't divide so easily into these two camps. And I think the reality that we're facing is that, yes, we tend to want to think, okay, China has kind of encompassed and embodied this vision of digital authoritarianism, this notion that states must control data, must control information, must control access to information. And then perhaps, large American companies comprise the other side of that, where you have companies controlling access to data and information. But I think what Bob's point about that we need to actually kind of break that binary vision down and really go back to this idea of what does a values-based, human rights-based internet actually look like, and what does that mean in terms of whose job is it to control the data, to have access to the data, decide how it's used. And I think we're seeing some of those debates unfold very prominently now in Brussels. You mentioned the EU, of course. I think the concept of digital sovereignty is a bit of a dangerous one. I wish we would use different terms. So we're talking about how democracies are trying to grapple with these ideas, because we are finding ourselves in a world where we have the EU, but also European states. And then we have countries like Russia, which we haven't gotten into that yet, but I think we will. China, but also many others of the global South also grappling with those questions. And I think what we're trying to really get to is, how do we develop a regulatory framework, a regulatory environment that puts people first, while still not hampering what has been a competitive edge in many democracies, which is, of course, innovation and leadership and technology. But how do we maintain that balance, right? And I think the reason I said the digital sovereignty term I find so problematic when democratic countries use it is because it immediately buys into this notion that we are already living in a fragmented internet, that we're on the back foot when it comes to having an open, interoperable internet. But I think this is actually what we're trying to defend and have to defend, and not just defend, but really invest in a serious and real way. And just quickly to wrap up on this, we can talk about this for a very long time, but I think what we're actually seeing now is also these kind of hybrid forms of control over information, where we see some countries now looking to some Russian technologies around data surveillance, while at the same time looking to purchase and implement Chinese-made technologies when it comes to things like facial recognition. And we're seeing these kind of mixed models, mixing repressive legal regime, mixing advanced and sophisticated algorithmic technologies together. And what does that mean? Is that, how do we understand these hybrid forms, right? If you want to call them that. What is the actual spectrum we're talking about here? And it is very much a spectrum. So I think I'll just stop there, and I'd love to hear from others on this as well.
Thank you, Alina. I wanted to turn to Professor Lan before I turn to data stewardship. Professor Lan, could you tell us more a little bit about what do these hybrid models really mean for these other countries? And then based on what you said earlier about how we shouldn't dramatize and that there's a lot of common concerns between a lot of these different governments, a lot of different nation states, how do you reconcile that with the hybridization that Alina is speaking about as well?
Well, I think that in a way, I think that the reality is indeed, I think that it's the digital governance is indeed a hybrid spectrum of ways you can sort of regulate the behaviors of the companies and to control the flow of the data. I think every country have their concerns about safety and security for the public. So digital space shouldn't be a place that people can commit crime. I think that there are increasingly a lot more digital crimes than before. I think so. There's certainly a great concern for the government. At the same time, also many companies they control a lot of data, and they actually sometimes abuse that monopoly's power. And all of those behaviors are indeed have to be regulated. So I think that's where I think the government is trying to catch up with the regulation. I think as some of our colleagues mentioned about, I think democracy and human rights. I think that if people have come, to China and to see what the change of people's life, the change of people's access to technology, to information, to all of different things, they will see for themselves, that how China has made dramatic progress over the last 40 years since the reform began. So I think that a lot of these concepts are not just abstract concepts, but you have to really put that into reality. And to be able to achieve this progress, China needs a stable and safe political environment and economic environment. And that's, the government is trying to do. Of course, I think different people may have different opinions in terms of where you can do more, where you can do less. I think that's something that indeed, I think China is willing, actually, I think even within China, there are debates about where there's too much control, where there's less. I think that's the kind of debate discussion. I think that'd be very useful. I think China certainly would be very willing to be part of that.
Thank you. And you led us quite nicely into the shift I wanted to take us on. Bob, I wanted to ask you, look, a lot of this is a lot of the access of users to different markets. A lot of, Professor Lan mentioned security in public spaces, safety online. All of this is facilitated by the exchange or control of data, right? So how do these cyber sovereignty strategies interact with the concept of protecting user data? And to add on to that, what does the lack of transparency mean when governments use that type of data for the autonomy of the end user? What does it mean for the economy, according to you?
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that question. I think the way that I make sense of the relationship between cyber sovereignty and data sovereignty is that they're closely related. So in a Venn diagram, data sovereignty would fit inside of cyber sovereignty. So they're not one and the same, but that cyber sovereignty is a bit of an umbrella in which I imagine data sovereignty fitting inside of. But for me, the sort of the most exciting part of that question is that notion of autonomy, because that's where, if sovereignty is for the state, autonomy arguably is for the user or the people. And so I think if you look at the role of autonomy in any movement in analog history, many of the issues that come up in a data-driven society where you see good tension, if I might say, playing out, is where there's historic collectivity in an analog space. So, you know, if people in communities are to have sovereignty online, right, they need control of their data. That is a form of autonomy that becomes real when we're talking about who can collect it, how can it be used, and ultimately how is it valued, right? So it's evaluated to promote a very particular presumption of consent, the presumption of the extraction of that data from the person to the company or to the government, right? But the lack of transparency undermines any real notion of autonomy. And I would say that if we're having, and so arguably not sovereignty if sovereignty is for the state. But so I would say that the lack of transparency instills state level sovereignty. It doesn't empower the user. So people in communities, when they have no insight into which platforms or governments are exploiting their data or how, that's where, and again, this is where there's the analog organizing realities. That's where labor disputes can come up. That's when poor access to public services happen. That's where there are information echo chambers, right? That's how monopolies are formed, by that obfuscation of the use of that data and a real misunderstanding that data is being even used for that purpose in general, right? But I think that it's important to say that there are some transparency mandates that do exist at the state level, whether that's GDPR or CCPA. You know, I think that there are a lot of those are flawed and very useful regulatory frameworks that actually do privilege transparency in their intent anyway. And then the other thing is that I think it's worth uplifting that you can have transparency, but without accountability mechanisms, they also become meaningless. And that's again where organized analog movements like labor are ahead of the game in whether it's around subject access requests, utilizing testing frameworks like GDPR for the purposes of rights to individuals who are also workers, and looking at where there are wins there. So I think that that accountability is where the role of the state also comes in for me. So there's tensions that arise at the community level can be handled within the community, but then there are larger issues, and that's where we do need larger legal apparatus. That's where regulation comes in a way that's meaningful. And so I think that that good tension is how the possibility of autonomy alongside of a notion of transparency and accountability can come to fruition.
If I could just jump in really quick on Bob's point, I'm going to insert a contrarian point to the mix, maybe for some debate. Well, I think it's absolutely right for us to be thinking about what does consumer choice, but also individual rights look like in the online space, and how do we give individuals more information about how their data is being used and shared. I think in reality, this often manifests itself in putting so much burden on individuals to make really complex decisions. Most people don't have the technical expertise, nor should they, about how algorithms work, how data is being run, what if they put something in their Facebook account, why they get advertisements, through cookies and everything else and trackers on other websites to those products. And what I see increasingly happening, especially with some of the European legislation that's now moving further and further into this space, the data access space, is that consumers and individuals are being asked to make all of these decisions, like the GDPR, for example. All of us now see these cookie accept, decline, and I think most people just click through it. We've seen a little bit of research showing this. A lot of people don't really understand what they're agreeing to or why. And some of the legislation that is about to likely become law in Europe, it will take the next step. So for example, there's some potential for the so-called Digital Markets Act, which is currently being debated in the EU, to ask users, would you like your data to be shared with company X, company Y, company Z, company A? It's like, why would anybody even know what these companies are? And how are you supposed to make decisions about that? So the burden question, I think, is very, very real. And the question becomes, okay, how do we not talk about euphemisms of consumer choice, but actually about making it easy for individuals to make these decisions? And how can that actually be done in practice? And I think we haven't found how to do that yet. And so that's why, for some other reasons, I'm very skeptical about some of these legislative efforts, because at the end of the day, they talk about consumer rights, but it's actually consumer burdens if we look at how they're actually going to work in practice. And my other contrarian point here is, just going back to what's been happening in countries like Russia, where you still have quote unquote Western companies operating in these increasingly repressive regimes, and how the government there sees this as a real threat to its own stability and longevity, because opposition leaders, independent voices have been explicitly relying on things like YouTube and other Western platforms that are also the ones we're talking about as making some deeply problematic decisions in other spaces. But without YouTube access, we wouldn't have any independent space anymore in countries like Russia and increasingly elsewhere. And I think it's actually very, very possible that the Russian government will just outlaw these platforms, so-called Western platforms, American companies, whatever they are, very, very soon, as they try to craft alternates to YouTube and other platforms as well. And I think we have to ask ourselves, does this really serve the broader desire for freedom of expression in the world, or not? When we're thinking about how do we also regulate these companies and ask for more transparency and accountability, as we should. So I just want to bring a couple of points of nuance and complexity into the conversation, because these are the real issues I think we're grappling with right now. And to be honest, I don't think the companies themselves have answers. I don't think democratic governments have answers as to what do we do. And I'm afraid that we're just kind of on this train moving forward and further and further into much more authoritarianly oriented online space.
Thank you, Alina. And I would love to turn it to Javi, because I think you led us quite nicely into basically the differences between user agency and governance of digital data and AI, et cetera, which I will turn to Professor Lan after Javi. But Javi, please go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a very interesting point. And one of the things that I like about this conversation we're having is what we're trying to find in terms of nuance, right? And again, being practical. This is not about very alien concepts or strange concepts, right? Such as sovereignty, which is in itself a concept that evolved through a good chunk of a couple of hundred years, if you go from the Romans to what we're now discussing about sovereignty, right? So it is a very interesting issue. One thing that I would say in terms of user agency is, and finding nuance and practicality in this, is that we shouldn't think either between a dichotomy between total user control and regulator control, right? Or state control, right? I think that some of the most interesting examples of user agency revolve around communities. You have the example of Wikipedia, for example, and how it regulates, right, and moderates content. This is one of the most open platforms around, and it's one of the platforms that has less issues with hate speech, with polarization, with all of these kind of things. And that is because there is a careful design behind it in order to enable communities to be self-aware and to be sovereign in some way, right? In terms of exercising control. So maybe every user won't be equipped, let's say, to make these very granular choices and accept every one of the prompts that the legislation is asking for, right? But it is very important that the information is out there and that the choice is there by law and that law enables the choice. How we design the user experience around that, like how many prompts, where how the pattern should go, that's a different conversation maybe. But the good thing is that communities are there and they have access to it, right? Copyright is another interesting example. If you have exceptions to copyright, then communities of artists, creators, remixers, and so on will revolve around that and find ways to create things. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone should be able to remix something or to reuse something and so on, right? So I think that's an interesting point in the middle, which is community and how community interacts with this. And again, I just want to recognize the need for practical approaches. It is certain that we need a practical approach for safety, to fight crime, which is indeed a very understandable concern, right? And to be honest, and to add more nuance into the mix, I agree with Alina that a lot of the democratic governments are actually now acting as authoritarians. When I think about the misuse of the concept of sovereignty, I don't just go necessarily to China as the easy example that everyone likes to rant about. I'm thinking about Argentina, the place where I live, where strict surveillance has been terribly deployed all around Latin America, actually, by hiring incidentally Chinese companies, but it could be companies from other places as well, to acquire technology for massive surveillance in the streets without any public oversight, without any public transparency. So that there's where the state is failing people. And the states are the failing people are not only the Russias or the Chinas of the world, or whatever we like to say, but it's also our own states, right? And finally, for example, in the US, facial recognition technology in the hands of the police and so on, we have seen a lot of things going on. We have seen governments like Israel, which is a beacon of democracy in the region, right? For some people, use internet referral units, for example, to just ask for the takedown of content for platforms directly without any judicial oversight. So if we go into digging into the examples, we will find a lot of things where, in theory, democratic governments that are sometimes champions of human rights in some spaces or in some narratives are actually the main violators, right? And don't get me started on the companies and how companies can actually violate human rights, which is something that we have been fighting for decades at Access Now. So I think that's a very interesting point to bring to the nuanced conversation. But again, I would say it's about community and it's about putting users first, but not necessarily user as an individual or as a consumer, but as a member of a community.
Thank you, Javier. Professor Lan, so we started to talk about data and the multiple layers that are involved in the governance of data, whether it's through companies or governments. How, in your perspective, do these issues of data stewardship arise in the context of artificial intelligence in China? And can you walk us through how does the Chinese government, for instance, deal with these very nuanced, complex nature of decisions that users have to make on a daily basis?
Well, I think our colleagues have talked about the challenge that faced by consumers. I think that Chinese consumers are facing a similar problem. So many choices actually becomes really a burden. I think that for the AI technology, I think China has started an AI governance committee, a few years ago, which publicized, I think, an AI governance principles, provides the general guidance to the companies and to the general public about how actually, to have sort of more responsible use of the technology. And also, I think recently the committee also released an ethical guide for the companies and also for the society in terms of how to use the technology. But of course, I think that there's always this challenge of how do you regulate, so many companies, out in the market, and particularly the use of the technology is even more challenging. So I think that we are now also advocating for the companies themselves to really to volunteer voluntarily to abide by these principles and set up mechanisms to follow the ethical principles. Of course, at the same time, the government has also accelerated its legislative sort of efforts. On November 1st, China began to implement the personal information protection law, and again, it's to help the protection of personal individual information. So I think that's the kind of, so it's a combined effort by both the government, the market, and also including the society, the community, to try to find the right space for the technology that can be used most beneficially.
Absolutely. And so my next question for all of you, actually, and it actually weaves in quite nicely with one of the questions we got from the audience so far, is how can governments reconcile the concepts of data stewardship that we were just talking about in the context of cyber governance strategy in a way that respects human rights considerations? Essentially, how does cyber sovereignty relate to fundamental rights? For instance, are there specific legal standards regulating this globally, which we know has been a very tough nut to crack for almost 2 decades now? And in such a case, what are the main obligations that a state has towards the protection and respect of such rights?
I mean, I think this gets to the nuance that both Alina and Javier were talking about, right? The range of the difference between an informed public and a burdened individual, and then actually having legal structures for communities to have rights, whether it's to have mediated space, to have an intermediary space, to have, whether they're data commons or data trusts, whether it's about local regulation around data and data use and its extraction. So I think it's sort of the framework of profit versus public good. And I think that that's where there's the kind of regulation that arguably can allow for community level autonomy and both access and permission for data use and its value. And I think that and that's why I was sort of intimating that where folks have there is an organized public or constituency in historically analog frameworks, that's where we're seeing data rights show up most present, exactly for Alina's point that it won't first be the burdened individual, but it's certainly it will be an organized public. And so I think that if there's public demand, which just gets back to the earlier question around transparency, and there's the potential for any kind of accountability, then you can start to see organized frameworks demand and also build for, I mean, there's the technical implication, and build for a middle ground so that communities can have power and access.
Bob, thank you. And just to follow up on that, what does that mean when a lot of these technologies or governance models are exported to countries where that type of accountability and transparency or that type of organized governance may not have happened yet? Maybe that the debate hasn't been held there yet. What does it mean when the two polar sides, so to speak, start to expand in different countries and different jurisdictions?
As is often the case, I mean, that leads to incredible opportunity and also the potential for incredible abuse. So it really depends on how good of a job people are doing in terms of mitigating dis and misinformation. I mean, I think that that's really the greatest or lack of information at all, right? I mean, I think those are the greatest indicators of whether there's the potential for that kind of control. But certainly innovation always exists in places where there isn't top-down structures, right? That's people are innovating all of the time to live their lives fruitfully, and that's actually where the greatest innovation lies. So information has always been exchanged in ways that are meaningful at the community level. They will continue to be, whether it's digital or analog. And I think actually respecting that level of innovation, and for those of us who fund in the space, regardless of borders, I think that those are places to invest to ensure that innovation that long exists in those places that are deregulated or not, or the regulation hasn't yet come, to ensure that the community actually has the largest and the most informed voice.
Yeah, if I could just pile up on top of that, Bob. I think there's two things that we want to think about when it comes to this. One is, well, obviously the role of not just states, but we've been dancing around the role of the industry, of course, which we're talking about it in sort of indirect terms. But I think there's a reality that I would just flag, one trend line that I've been seeing and watching in a very concerning way, and that's how, again, states interact with so-called foreign companies. A lot of these foreign companies tend to be US companies because they're the large companies still operating across the world in various contexts. And by states, I'm really talking about more authoritarian leaning states. And this is a trend of like data localization, and how more and more governments, states are asking and forcing companies through increasingly draconian legal means to store data on their borders about their users. And what that usually means, in a place where you don't have checks and balances, you don't have a proper process of due diligence and judicial independence, is that data on individuals is then basically at the control of government administrative agencies, right? And I think we're seeing some of the similar trends of the push towards data localization in democracies as well, to go back to Javi's earlier point about how there's not really this bright line between how democracies are looking at governance versus how states are. But I think the role of companies is so critical here, because on the one hand, we in the democratic world, especially in the United States and Europe, expect companies to be these bearers of democratic values and principles, and provide free and open space and all over the world. And we want them to kind of be an attachment of democratic values. But I think this is a really high expectation to put on private industry. And we don't ask tobacco companies, or oil companies. One could say, well, maybe we should, ask these other industries to actually embody certain values and principles. But at the end of the day, these are profit-seeking entities. And that is what drives them. That's what drives their growth. It's what drives their incentive structures at the end of the day. So I think we've been kind of struggling, like in the United States in particular, where most of these companies find their home, even though they're international firms, obviously. What do we want these companies to do? And how do we want them to act when they have to share data with the intelligence services in Russia, for example? I mean, this is commonly done, and we don't know what to do about it. Companies have to abide the law, but how do we actually start to interject into these relationships that are happening, abroad in other countries, but where there are industry interests, there are state interests, and we have to ask ourselves, what is our interest as a democratic society, as a community of democracies, in how we can change, perhaps, or start to alter some of the reality on the ground. I think I'll just stop there. I had another comment about independent media and civil society, because this goes back to Bob, to your point about how do we actually create the space for innovation opportunities, for community empowerment, right? And I think that's a kind of a really core question that I hope we can also touch base a little bit on.
Alina, thank you so much. I think you're absolutely correct when you said that we were touching on the subject of industry, but only indirectly so far. And I was very glad to hear you bring that up. So I would love to turn to Professor Lan again and ask, just this week, we saw a news article that was reported that said the Chinese internet, the Cyberspace Administration, has announced new draft laws requiring any IPOs from Hong Kong to share data with Beijing on the basis of national security. This is a question that often comes up, right? And Alina hinted at it as well, is that industry sometimes has different expectations depending on the environment and ecosystem it is operating within. Could you walk us through what are the merits of having that, or not necessarily, because this type of news that came out generated a lot of criticism. So I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on that.
I think probably I will not comment the specific on that, but I think I wanted to make a few comments about Hong Kong. I think that certainly we've seen that, since Hong Kong's return to China in 1997, we've seen that there's been, Hong Kong has prospered, over the last, probably more than 2 decades now. I think that, I think with the, in recent years, we see the disruptions. And we see the, what my guess is that for our colleagues in the West may feel that's sort of like a freedom of expression. But the reality is that I have, many friends who work in China, in Hong Kong. Their daily life is totally disrupted. And in fact, I see, many universities are turned into chaos. The students cannot go to the, cannot even go to the universities, and when they bring their children to the kindergartens, and they were stopped by those you would call democracy defenders. They would say which side you belong to. Otherwise, if you do not follow them, they may actually hit you. That's the kind of situation that Hong Kong has never seen. I think that's the, I think we've all seen, the disruptions and the violence in Hong Kong. I think that really, but of course, I think some people who say that's a beautiful horizon people wanted to see. Unfortunately, that's not how Chinese people, not how Hong Kong people wanted to see. And so I think now, this is the recent change is basically try to restore the peace and security to Hong Kong, let Hong Kong to return to where it used to be, and to really become a peaceful and prosperous place. So I think that whatever the new regulation, I think if it's related to security and safety, I think in the context of what happened recently, I think it's quite understandable, right? But of course, I think when things have changed, for better, I think indeed, I think there could be ways to relax the flow of information. So I think that's the situation how I see it.
Thank you. And one of the questions we got from the audience is, how do you evaluate the role of multinational companies in controlling access to data in terms of the effect on human rights? And I'm going to turn to Javi for this, because I think there's multiple complex nuances in each of these different models that we're talking about. When it comes to evaluating the role of multinational companies, as well as having competing interests at stake, essentially, what do you suggest governments keep top of mind when designing these new governing models?
Well, that's an easy question. Thank you so much. I'm just kidding. It's the hardest ones I've ever heard. So let's begin by companies, right? Or in general, let's begin by the general idea of what we think the role of the state is, right? Sovereignty, again, as I said at the beginning, in my opinion, is a tool. It's a practical tool to ensure that the means of the state and the objectives of the state are aligned. What is that objective? Well, the objective of the state should be, at least in the general thinking around democratic institutions, the well-being of their people, right? The enjoyment of rights, the enhancement of liberties, or the abilities to live the life that you want to live in a way that is in a balance with the interests of the community, right? So you think about this, there are several I would say, limitations or problems that you may find when you try to make this objective a reality. One of them is the concentration of power, which is a thing that has been an issue in democracies for a long, long time, right? The concentration of power in private companies is a problem and has been a problem for a lot of time in democratic institutions. What should governments do and how that interacts with human rights? Well, basically, as we said before, the concentration of power in private companies enables human rights violations, either by their own activities, such as what happens with the right to privacy and data collection and data advertisement and data surveillance that we have seen recently in the hands of private corporations. But it also can be used by certain governments who use companies as proxies, as we have said before, to enable human rights violations, to enable censorship and the persecution of minorities, right? So in any case, the concentration of power creates a choke point. It creates one point that can be pressured by states, and also one point that concentrates enough power to generate a huge impact that can be very negative when it's misaligned, let's say, with objectives of public good. So the answer to that is basically to redistribute power, which is basically what a democracy is supposed to do. Actually, what Republican, for example, models of governance before have attempted to do is to divide power, to address concentration, right? To move it more towards the edges, which is interestingly one of the key features or elements in the design of the internet, to move the power and the decision making more to the edges and without a centralized point, choke point, right? So that has to do a little bit with how we think of the design of the internet in the future. We have seen proposals recently, technical proposals, to change protocols, to change basic building blocks of how the internet is designed in order to allow for more centralized control. That is a very problematic issue, because the idea is to push control to the sites and to the communities and to the, I would like to say users, because nowadays the design of internet technologies is affecting everyone, even the people that are not using it yet. So I say the people in general. And I would never say the consumers again, because it goes way beyond what a service could be. But this is the general idea. What governments can do then to put this up front is to think about this, about what is the objective they're trying to achieve. Of course, safety, well-being, better conditions for living, access to food, to education, to security are basic needs. But in order to meet them, we have several paths. Human rights are not exclusive. We should not force people to choose between safety, economic development, right? Or free expression or freedom of association and so on, right? So you know what I mean? So I wouldn't say that people need to be pushed into Faustian bargains, right? Between companies that don't respect their rights or governments that are ready to suppress their basic rights in order to allow them to access basic, safety, development, and so on. We need to find balances and ways in which we can offer people not a choice in terms of rights, but enable choices regarding technology so people can exercise their rights as they want. So more choice around technology, more competition, distributing power. I think that's the way to go in some of these cases.
Yeah, let me make a comment on Jeff's question. I think that indeed, ideal, of course, that we do not want to see the big monopolies and big companies exactly as what Javier just mentioned. But I think, unfortunately, when people study digital economy and they find a new phenomenon, there seems to be that the technology, it seems to actually support the kind of a major platform companies. And there seems some, what we call the positive feedback feature that makes if you have a larger platform, then you become more commercially successful, you become larger. And so that creates a sort of, a challenging question. How do you, in a way, promote the technology development and generate more benefits to the general public, but at the same time, to be able to regulate this kind of platform companies. And that's an issue that, I think also in China, I think that's sort of the what we're facing now. I think certainly, recently the government has, put out some regulations and some legislations, but still, those big companies, mega platform companies, they still are quite dominant, and that's sort of the inherent nature, natural monopoly nature of the platform companies is the one that really presents a challenge for regulation, as you just put it.
I completely agree with both of those statements, because I think inherent in the nature of the internet is that it flows across borders. And we see this everywhere. Just recently in the United States, we've seen how there is disinformation around political, public events, or health misinformation that is specifically targeted to specific communities in specific languages. And it doesn't always come from the same state. And this actually follows on Javi's point about, we shouldn't label users as users, because a lot of these problems flow outside of just the confines of just users. A lot of the problems that we're seeing flow outside of regular nation state borders. And to that end, I wanted to actually take a little bit of time. We have 20 minutes left on this panel and a few more questions from the audience, but I wanted to actually take us into the direction of manipulation of information online. And I'll preface it by this. There was a comment from the audience to something that Bob mentioned. And the comment said this: my experience is that Wikipedia, it's a two-faced problem. Yes, there are idealistic people there wanting to share human knowledge for free, between quotation marks, but there is a darker and more sinister side in which entries are kidnapped by biased editors, suspect of being paid in the service of powerful interests. Now, first, I would like to turn to Alina to set us up and answer the question about how does manipulation of information fit into this? And then I would like to turn to Bob after that with another question to follow on the comment from the audience. So Alina, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Wafa. This is another really easy question because it's a really difficult question, obviously. Just a quick personal anecdote. The reason that I started working on these issues that we're talking about now, about tech policy and data governance and broader tech governance, I actually came at this through the lens of disinformation when I was still a graduate student doing my PhD work, in the context of Russian state-funded disinformation campaigns to try to shape a certain narrative. At that time, this was back in 2013, 2014, around Russia's aggression and military invasion of Ukraine. And of course, since then, this has now become an issue that we're all really concerned with. Obviously, we've seen what can happen around elections in the United States, but now really all over the world, when state-funded enterprises, entities, individuals, intelligence agencies take it upon themselves to try to influence the democratic process, and how damaging that can be, regardless of whether voters change their minds and vote differently or not, how damaging that can be to just the broader public discourse, and especially what we really underestimate how vulnerable and fragile democratic governance is. Because at the end of the day, what holds democracies together is the notion of trust in institutions between individuals and the institutions, including representatives and other government agencies that serve the general public interest and the public good. And when that trust gets frayed, and when that trust is explicitly targeted by disinformation campaigns, for example, that is really kind of the soft underbelly of democracy, right? And I think we're struggling with that now because information manipulation in the online space is, one, very easy to do. There's no more lines between foreign and domestic disinformation campaigns, as you alluded to, Wafa. We've seen this in very, very bright terms around COVID and public health issues and vaccinations, that the domestic and foreign really play off each other, and we can't even separate the two anymore. And so I think the question is, what do we do now? I think there was one question that arose very early on as we all started to understand this broader problem of information manipulation, information influence operations, and how that tool can be so powerful in the wrong hands. But we haven't really been able to grapple with it in a real way in a democratic society, because at the end of the day, our government institutions aren't set up to respond quickly. Democracies historically and always move very, very slowly. We have passed no legislation on this issue, literally nothing. And on top of that, the entire kind of just at the governmental level, we're just not set up to respond to these kinds of threats that touch on issues around media literacy and education, issues around industry regulation, and issues around foreign interference in our elections. So when you put all that together, you can't point to a single governmental entity in the United States, certainly, and they can say, aha, they're in charge of this problem, they're figuring out. No, that really doesn't exist. And I don't see any momentum for something like that to be established, whether it's even the right way to think about these issues. And this is where I really come back to this point of, how do we empower communities? Because at the end of the day, as we're seeing trust in democratic institutions decline in the United States and across the world in established democracies, the messenger really matters, right? So we're talking about disinformation. How do we actually get people to, maybe change their minds and see a different side of the story, that maybe vaccines, aren't implanting chips in your body, for example. One of the conspiracy theories has been out there. But it's really difficult to break through if people aren't hearing these messages from their own community members and people they trust. And I think we've seen this very effectively in the public health domain around vaccine disinformation. And I think we should be right now taking lessons learned as to how community engagement works and what works and what doesn't, and applying that to other issues, because at the end of the day, this is going to be with us forever at this point. And I think we need to really be thinking about in countries where there is a very weak or not well-funded, underdeveloped civil society space, which is the majority of the world, by the way, where you don't have independent media that can function well because you need a lot of resources. You don't have a civil society kind of watchdog space to monitor government actions and to suggest solutions and to really organize in the ways I think Bob was suggesting. So how do we actually help these local domestic actors? How do we ensure that there is a live and active independent space to empower communities people can talk to each other, advocate, organize together, and really push for what they need? I think at the end of the day, this is how we start to move the needle on that democracy authoritarianism spectrum, kind of towards democracy a little bit more.
Absolutely. Bob, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I have to give props to Javier because actually he made the comment about Wikimedia, not me. But,
yeah, I received a correction on that one, actually. Yeah,
no, it's all good. But I think actually the point, the impact that troll armies have inside of a Wikipedia frame speaks to the success of Wikipedia and why there would be a concerted effort in that regard. I don't think it's about the light and dark forces of good or evil. I think it's that it's actually a space that is operating in a way. It shows the value of information. I mean, I think that's what that kind of concerted effort indicates. Sorry, I'm in New York City and you can probably hear that. So it was to underscore my point about the value of information. But I do I think that some of the points that, all of the points that Alina was bringing up are really crucial, but I think, I don't think that we can underplay what is going to happen in 2024 when there are so many elections happening all over the world, and the role of targeted misinformation and disinformation. And I also want to say that those are very well-funded efforts, whether it's around gender ideology or things that have we can point to a number of elections where, a gender panic was created because it's a rallying issue, similarly to the way that we see education and critical race theory showing up in United States politics, because there are rallying issues to galvanize votes towards more authoritarian leadership. And so I think, and those are that information is disseminated largely not in Wikipedia, but via SMS and WhatsApp groups and in local, very siloed and not independent media channels. So I think, the level of harm reduction that we need to do, but also the level of organizing that we need to do, and really seeing that those are very, very, very well-funded efforts, that they have been for a long time. Those efforts are often imported from the West elsewhere. And I think that, that if we're looking at organizing from mis and disinformation perspective, we need to actually not be in a tech silo and look at civil society actors that have actually been organizing around this work in other issue areas, if you will, for decades. And that's where I think that we can actually bring sort of the greatest possibility to bear, whether it's in organized space around gender, around youth, around workers, around agriculture. I think that there's where we see labor, I think where we see really organized civil society who've been combating that, what it would mean for folks really dealing with notions of digital democracy and who are building that technology to join in those ways. And sometimes there are crossovers in our respective institutions even, and we don't know what people are working on across the hall. I think that we have to break those silos in terms of where we're investing movement strategies as well as resource.
Thank you, Bob. And actually, I will turn to Javier after all. There's a question from the audience that all of you are free to answer, but I do think that Javier might have a few comments. Just so we're all aware, we have about 10 minutes left. And so Javier, after this and after your reply, I'll have two last questions for the panel as a whole to answer to close us off today. So the question is this: one aspect of countries each opting for different ways to regulate content online is that people in different countries might have access to wildly different sources and quote unquote different facts. This seems particularly worrying given that the world is facing challenges that more and more require common concerted responses. I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts on this, and is there an alternative? And Professor Lan, please feel free to jump in after Javier as well.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that one of the interesting elements of the question is this idea of different sources and different facts. I think it's fascinating how we have now the capacity to be thinking about different facts or alternative facts, as some have said, infamously, right? I think that we as human beings have both the disadvantage, but also the advantage of not being scientists and not having to define truth and reality based solely on facts. We have values, we have beliefs, we have other things that are actually great and that enable us as communities to do great things. If we were just able to, for example, analyze risk for everything we are supposed to be doing or plan to do in a scientific way, we will likely not do anything and be paralyzed by that analysis, right? So the capacity that we have to omit facts and actually build something deeper beyond facts is something that is good. It's not a bad thing. So let me start by that. The role that facts and information play in a democracy is a very complex one. It's actually a concept and an idea that is negotiated and is built in a democracy, right? So if you think, for example, on the impact of misinformation, that is a very big problem. Research is still trying to determine the specific length of the impact of disinformation in platforms. It is, of course, a problem that it is amplified and that platforms make a profit out of it, which is a problem in itself that needs to be addressed, regardless of the consequences or regardless of the specific effects. But one thing that is very interesting is that in most of the cases in which misinformation has become a big problem, there has been a more complex scenario at play, where legacy media has played a very big role. Think, for example, of Myanmar, think of the Capitol in the US, think of the Bolsonaro election and so on, okay? So in all of these cases, legacy media has played a very important role. And in some places of the world, for example, in my own region, in Latin America, legacy media is still the main source of news and information for most people, and it's heavily concentrated. And it has a history of interdependence with the government. And another element is that, as Bob also mentioned, there's a lot of money behind this, and there's a lot of political actors fueling this. Myanmar could not have been possible without decades of what the military were doing there. Having a president in the US calling for violence or relativizing violence for a long time really enables this. These are authority figures. They convey a certain view of what the state could or could not do if you decide to act violently. So all of this is a very complex issue. And I bring this complexity in just to really think about the solutions. If you think that enabling one center of definition of what facts are, of what the truth is, it's actually a very counterproductive idea, because that sounds interesting, just to have one source of fact. But in issues where violence is at play, for example, it's not that easy as establishing scientific fact. Even in the case of scientific fact, like in the case of vaccines that work very well, we are struggling, right? Imagine what could happen in concepts such as sovereignty or free expression or community organizing. So we need some complexity there.
Thank you, Javier. Professor Lan, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think that's a critical question. I think indeed we're facing a lot of common challenges, and here are really, we need to work together. I think fortunately, we do have scientific communities, that's sort of based on, the same value. I think they work together around the globe. So I think that's why I think the joint work of scientists are so important. I think, for example, the IPCC has played such a vital role in providing the information, providing the analysis that the world needs to address the climate change. So I think that also, for the, for dealing with the COVID, again, I think global science community has worked together, to try to understand the behavior of the virus and to see what's the best way to deal with it. So I think that, the scientific community can play a critical role in here. So I think, but of course, the underlying, support for that is that we need to have a culture to respect science, to respect the public institutions, and that's where I think that now we're fighting with.
Thank you so much. So we have two questions from the audience I would love to cover, but I know we only have 5 minutes left. So I'll ask this question to all of you, and hopefully each of you will be able to give me a quick sum up of your thoughts by the end of this panel. So especially in decades, the question goes, where fundamental rights are exercised through the internet, does this mean that people around the world have different access to their rights based on where they live, regardless of cultural aspects? And then to add on to that, another question from the audience that's similarly related: how could journalists, media organizations, and the general public stay ahead of censorship or regulations to come, given that all of our livelihoods essentially exist online nowadays?
Wafa, I can kick us off here briefly on that. These are really fantastic questions. I think, unfortunately, to the first question about do individuals have sort of a different access to fundamental rights based on where they live, I think the unfortunate answer to that is yes. Because if you live in a regime like in Russia or China or elsewhere that is a more authoritarian style state, you don't have the same access to your fundamental rights. And in fact, the information that you share about yourself, or the apps to use, the websites you go to, your medical records, all of those things, those are actually used for the purpose of state control and surveillance and repression. And that is the complete opposite of what we think about when it comes to the expression of fundamental rights online. And I think, again, to go back to the beginning of our conversation, this is where I find the rhetoric around digital sovereignty so dangerous in democratic societies, because it reinforces this idea that based on where you live, you have different access, right? And I think we need to be getting much more sort of on the offensive side of things, on the assertive side of things, to say, no, this is not the kind of online world, digital world period that we want to be living in. And I think I'll just stop there since we're running so short on time.
Right as we got started. Javier or Bob? Bob, would you like to go ahead?
Sure. I think that yes, there's always a disparity in terms of access to rights, or the right or the ability to exercise our rights. That is certainly true. So I don't know that I would add to that other than to plus one that comment. But I do think what's important, and this is actually perhaps speaks more to the danger of the notion of sovereignty, is that while individuals or citizens are having wildly different experiences, the way that data transcends borders for profit and trade and to uplift the nation state and its economies and or industries economies in an effort to aggregate wealth and power it transcends those same realities. And I think that that's actually where the bulk of this where the nuance of this conversation lies in that. So that's, and again, maybe I'm pointing to what I see as the greater polarity or binary here. And so I think that's a particularly, I do not think in the countries where you would say people have less access to exercise their human rights in an online platform, that there's a decrease in the function of data being utilized in that society and or the value ascribed it. So I think that that's important to hold as we're digging into solutions and wanting to put all of the facts on the table.
Let me jump
Sure.
in here that in terms of rights, I think, of course, when we talk about human rights, the human rights, I think there are, in campuses, there's so many different elements, including the rights to information, including the rights to health, to education, and to be free from poverty. I think it's all of those elements that we all wanted to have. I think, as my colleagues already mentioned, that there's huge disparities around the world in those rights. So we shouldn't just focus on one, but forget the others. So I think the challenge is, how do we actually improve the access to all of those rights that we want, and to make substantive improvement, progress along those lines. I think that's why I think what we're facing, the challenge we're facing. And also, we don't want to gain some rights, but at the cost of other rights. And I think that's what we see since the pandemic. We see that, for example, the safety and the security, in the U.S. is really, I think, turning bad, compared to previous years. And just recently, seeing a Chinese student gunned down in Chicago without any reason. I think that's the kind of situation that we are very, very much concerned. So we want to improve rights on everything, not just on particular one side, and also certainly not, at the cost of the human lives.
Absolutely. And this is where the different, so to speak, polarities can work together more. So we are technically out of time. I did want to give the floor to Javier before closing us off for a few more seconds, sorry.
Promise it's going to be just a few seconds. Okay, just for the last question about how to stay ahead of censorship, if you're a journalist or an activist or user, fight for a free and open internet. That would be the best answer that I can think of. Get informed, follow the activists and the people who are fighting for this, and make sure that your government and your representatives are thinking of your well-being and your best interest when it comes to regulation. And that's also political participation. That's it.
I couldn't think of a better way to close us off. Thank you, Javier. Thank you to the audience who was with us here today. My name is Wafa. I was your moderator for this panel. Obviously, we just got started in speaking about this issue. I hope we'll be able to continue the conversation moving forward. And again, thank you so much to the panelists for giving us their thoughts and their expertise. And I wish you all a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day. Take care, everybody.